Okay, so just welcoming everybody to the History Matters lecture tonight. I have to say that we are all missing you so much and not being able to be physically together on campus. So part of the plan for tonight is to spend some time together, even if it's only in a virtual way. Of course, the other fun thing that we're going to do tonight is talk about witchcraft. And just in time for Halloween, it's a suitably gloomy and rainy and depressing night out there for this kind of subject. And I could see an entire Halloween movie kind of being filmed like right in the kind of weather we have right now going on in Conway. Um, so I'm coming to you from the Hendrix College West Conway Annex, also known as my living room. Sasha, would you say that you're in Old Conway? Okay, so the Old Conway branch of Hendrix College. So some background on my colleague, Sasha, Dr. Pfau. She's a professor of history here at Hendrix College, and she teaches medieval and early modern European history, including a very popular course on magic and witchcraft. So for some of you students, if you've tried to take this class, you'll know that it requires some bid points to actually get into it. So she's published an article on witchcraft called Ritualized Violence Against Sorcerers in 15th Century France, which appeared in the journal Magic, Ritual, and Witchcraft in 2013, which I had no idea there was a whole journal on that, but it sounds like a really interesting read. Her book is forthcoming and coming out pretty soon. It is Medieval Communities and the Mad, Narratives of Crime and Mental Illness in Late Medieval France. It's going to be published in December and focuses on the ways that medieval communities identified and dealt with mental illness. I also have Dr. Pfau's curriculum vitae, and that's a resume for students who may not have heard of this before. And you've got some terrific titles on here, so I just chose a couple that I liked of publications. Warfare, Trauma, and Madness in French Remission Letters. Sounds gripping. And I thought also that Chutes and Ladders, Prison Breaks in Late Medieval France was a very clever analogy to a 20th century board game. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Pfau and her lecture, Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, The Legacy of Witchcraft in the 18th and 19th Centuries. Take it away, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Deb. So when Dr. Skoke approached me about giving this talk, she said, I thought we might do something a little bit lighter for Halloween and have a talk on witchcraft. And as you can tell from the titles that she was just reading off, my work is not really light. So I said, what about if I do something a little bit later, more from my teaching of my magic and witchcraft course, and think about the legacy of witchcraft, so we don't have to get into trials, so we don't have to get into quite the same level of violence, and maybe we can look at some pretty pictures. Unfortunately, in order to talk about witchcraft at all, we are going to talk about some violence, and we are going to talk about some things that are maybe less comforting, and then we'll get to the pretty pictures, I promise. But I just thought I should put up front that a lot of my work is not fun. It is kind of dark. But I find it really fascinating and interesting, and hopefully you will too. So to start with, I just want to give us the background that we need to see where we're moving to get into the 18th and 19th centuries. So the witchcraft trials of the 16th and 17th centuries really emerged as part of a combination of popular beliefs that had been circulating before then about the concept of maleficia. And this is the idea of harm, magical harm. So this is the idea that witches will harm your cattle. The idea that witches will call storms like the one that we have right now in Conway that will destroy your crops. The idea that witches will cause people to become ill. So these are all these kind of ideas about the kind of magical harm that sorcerers, magical practitioners could cause to people. These popular ideas then combined, starting really in the 15th century, with elite beliefs about satanic ritual and the idea that there were people out there who were worshiping the devil in order to get the kind of power that would allow them to do all of these kinds of terrifying things. And so these two ideas kind of came together and then emerged into the witchcraft trials. So you kind of need both ideas among the general population about the things that witches can do, and you need people in positions of power and authority, like judges, like inquisitors for the church, who are willing to take these ideas seriously and then turn them into this large, or pull them into this larger theological problem of devil worship. And that's where the trials come from. They start to disappear in the sort of end of the 17th century and in the 18th century. And that happens for the most part because of judicial skepticism. So that's what starts happening, is actually a large-scale reform of the judicial system. That means that some of the things that were allowing these witchcraft trials to exist start to go away. So one of the things that happens is we see a movement towards centralization, and this happens at different times in different places. And so we actually see different sort of schedules for when witchcraft trials fall off. So the process of centralization makes some of these local trials less and less possible, and particularly the ones that kind of spiral out of control. You might be familiar, for example, with the Salem witch trial that spirals out of control, and just there's so many accusations upon accusations. And that's an example of a place where judicial fragmentation makes that possible. Another thing that's really important for this is that there are some new ideas and new concerns emerging about what constitutes legal evidence and what constitutes legal proof, that leads people to rely less and less on torture. Now, torture was used in continental Europe for all kinds of trials, but it was particularly fruitful in getting people to confess to accusations of witchcraft in particular. And so if you can't use torture, if you can't rely on torture as much, you might get fewer and fewer confessions. Now, this isn't necessarily, it's not necessary to have torture in order to get witchcraft confessions, because we also have witchcraft confessions in legal systems where they don't rely on torture. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, in Britain, they don't have torture, but they still have witchcraft trials. So it's not entirely related to torture, but it is still a piece of that puzzle for how you can get, particularly the trials that kind of spiral out of control. The other thing is that we see a really new and more demanding standard of proof that shifts the burden from the accused, so the person who has been accused of the crime, to the accuser, or the person who accuses someone of a crime, right? And so that means, again, right, instead of saying, well, prove that you're not a witch, now it's prove that they are a witch, right? And so you can see that that shift might change, particularly in cases where there isn't solid judicially approved evidence and proof, it might become harder and harder to actually push this forward. And then another thing that's happening is the profession of lawyer is exploding in this period. And so we're starting to get lawyers provided for accused witches. And lawyers are really good at getting into the nitty-gritty of legal proof and saying, no, you don't have enough to hold my client. No, you don't have enough to move my client forward into torture, right? You don't have enough evidence for this case to move forward. And so that actually often tends to drive down witchcraft trials in this period. The other piece of this, and there's an argument in the scholarship about which one actually happens first, but the other piece of this is the Enlightenment, right? Which one, is it judicial skepticism or is it the Enlightenment that causes witchcraft trials to go away? It seems fairly persuasive to suggest that it is judicial skepticism that starts the process, but the Enlightenment certainly helps it along. And so this is part of a larger cultural shift that maybe some of you are familiar with, right? That actually changes the way that people are thinking about conflict, from thinking about conflict between God and the devil, right? Which is, of course, where we get those concerns about witches in particular, to a focus on the conflict between the enlightened and the unenlightened, or the barbaric, right? And the barbaric could be people from other cultures who are not Western European. The barbaric could be also other Western European people who have not yet become part of the enlightened elite, who are reading and thinking and talking in new ways. And so that shift also means that now, where before witchcraft beliefs on a popular level, those beliefs about maleficia, about magical harm, were embraced by the elite as part of this larger conflict between God and Satan, now they're being rejected as a lack of reason, right? As irrational beliefs, superstition. And so now it's about, we are enlightened and we don't believe in that stuff, and you are the unenlightened masses who still believe in those things that are clearly not part of a rational worldview. Therefore, witchcraft in the Enlightenment becomes pathologized. It becomes thought of as a mental illness, as something that could be cured, as opposed to an actual practice that involves worship of the devil and that could be efficacious, right? And so in this period, the occult actually moves into other arenas. So, and we'll talk about how that happens, particularly later as a reaction against the Enlightenment, in art, in literature, in the fringe sciences. So, alchemy and the mesmerism, those kinds of things, and then in Freemasonry as well. And so the occult is moving into these other places rather than being part of the sort of worldview of the elite in general. And just as one example of what this kind of thing looks like, this is William Hogarth's print, Credulity, Superstition, and Fanaticism, a Medley. And you can see here that he's combining all kinds of things that he, as an enlightened individual, disapproves of, like the preacher at the top of the pulpit, at the top of the right-hand side, who has these little puppets of the witch and the devil that he's using to manipulate his parishioners. And then down below, you have actually a woman at the bottom giving birth to rabbits. And so there's all kinds of things going on in this image. We could spend hours just talking about this, but I'm just going to draw your attention to those two elements of it. So, in terms of thinking about this idea that the Enlightenment causes a shift towards thinking about the separation between the elite, rational, reasoned individual and the popular, irrational, unreasonable individuals, I'm going to draw your attention to a case that was discussed by a scholar named Edmund Morgan in an article called The Witch and We the People, which he published in 1983. And he doesn't go quite as far as I want to go with this. It's a pretty short article, and it doesn't really dwell. He doesn't have the space to really dwell on this as much as I want to. But it's really interesting, and he gives us access to all of the newspaper articles that were being published, and so that's what we're going to look at tonight, because I think it's actually really interesting for thinking about this. So, the Constitutional Convention. I know I'm not an American historian, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. The Constitutional Convention happened between May and September of 1787. And one of the key questions that the Constitutional Convention raised was who should be given the right to vote? And how should we decide that? Now, they didn't end up deciding it. They decided to leave it to the states, but the states, for the most part, set up requirements of property ownership for who could have the right to vote. But the question was up in the air at the Constitutional Convention, and there was a possibility that the right to vote could be opened up to more people. And so, witchcraft beliefs, right, are being used to separate the enlightened individuals from the backward, irrational people. In fact, earlier in October of 1730, Benjamin Franklin had published in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, a satire of a witch trial that he used to highlight the importance of reason and the fact that the general population lacked it. Proof positive by look at what they think about witches. And so during the Constitutional Convention, we see emerging in some of these newspapers in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Packet. On May 11th, 1787, they published a story about a woman named Old Korbmacher, or basket maker in German, who had reportedly been attacked on May 5th near the New Market, which was on the south side of town. And they're using this story. They don't explicitly do this, but I'm pretty sure they're using this story to raise some questions for the people at the Constitutional Convention about whether we should trust the general population. And so let's look at the kinds of things that they talk about. So, upon a supposition she was a witch, she was cut in the forehead according to ancient and immemorial custom by some persons of the vicinity. This old body long since labored under suspicions of sorcery and was viewed as the pest and nightmare of society in those parts of the town where she had hitherto lived. She was commonly called at Spring Garden Korbmacher by the Germans, and on that score, on the present and other occasions, unfortunately became the victim of vengeance of some individuals who afforded her the most pointed abuse which so misled a passion and resentment could possibly impose and inflict. I think we can see really clearly here the language that they're using to build a sense that this population, this group of people, this mob committing violence on this woman are unenlightened, are misled, right? Are doing things because of ancient and immemorial custom rather than because of reasonable choices about what you should do. And so here they're really kind of harping on this idea that the population is misled, right? Is wrong to see her as a witch, right? Is not rational. They keep going and say that the absurd and abominable notions of witchcraft and sorcery hopefully would no more predominate in an empire like ours that has emancipated itself from the superstitions of authority, and in fact every other species of superstition consisting in the bondage of the mind, of the body or the mind. Witchcraft beliefs therefore don't belong in the free and civilized parts of independent America, yet prejudices, worm-eaten prejudices, as our old companions, are hard to be parted with. So they're also using this to say, hey, we should be beyond this. We, in our new America that has thrown off these superstitions of authority, we should be beyond these superstitions of witchcraft, but we're not. And we need to work to make sure that we are. And so don't trust the general population because they're doing these things, they're believing these things that are wrong. In the same issue, they talk a little bit about the Constitutional Convention and say, as the time approaches for the opening business of the Federal Convention, it is natural that every lover of his country should experience some anxiety for the fate of an expedient so necessary, yet so precarious. Upon the event of this great council, indeed, depends everything that can be essential to the dignity and stability of the national character. And they've already told us about the things that don't belong in that national character elsewhere in the issue, right? They've told us superstition, old beliefs about witches don't belong in the dignity and stability of our new nation. All right, so it keeps going. There are further reports in July, on July 10th of 1787. This is in a slightly different newspaper, the Pennsylvania Evening Herald. So they report that we are sorry to hear that the poor woman who suffered so much some time ago under the imputation of being a witch, and the emphasis is in the original, has again been attacked by an ignorant and inhuman mob. On Tuesday last, she was carried through several of the streets and was hooted and pelted as she passed along. A gentleman who interfered in her favor was greatly insulted, while those who recited the innumerable instances of her art were listened to with curiosity and attention. So here we can see, again, the ignorant and inhuman mob who is attacking this woman as a witch. And the gentleman who intercedes on her behalf is insulted, but the ignorant and inhuman mob applaud those who are listing all the terrible maleficia that she, they say, has done. It must seriously affect every humane mind that in consequence of the barbarous treatment lately suffered by the poor old woman called a witch, she died on Wednesday last. It is hoped that every step will be taken to bring the offenders to punishment in justice to the wretched victim, as well as the violated laws of reason and society. And again, I think the language is so interesting here, right? Every humane mind, not like the minds of those mobs, should be concerned that this barbarous treatment caused this woman to die, and they should be brought to justice because of the violated laws of reason and society. So it's not just that they were a mob who injured this woman and caused her death, but it's that they have violated the laws of reason and, again, like rationality, enlightened thinking. So the end of the story doesn't come until after the Constitutional Convention is over. On October 27th of 1787, the Pennsylvania Evening Herald again published something about the case. And this time it was about the actual trial. So they tell us that on Monday last, the city sessions commenced, and on Friday, the business of the court was concluded. Several persons were condemned to the wheel and barrow, but the greater number of bills were for keeping disorderly houses and committing assaults and battery, a melancholy proof of the depraved manners and the contentious spirit of the times. One woman who had been indicted for some violence offered to the person of the unhappy creature that was lately attacked by a mob under the imputation of being a witch, maintained the justice of that opinion and insinuated her belief that her only child sickened and died under the malignant influence of a charm. So here there's the context, right, of all of the other cases that indicate to us that, you know, there are depraved manners in our nice city that we might deplore. But then there's this particular case that we're pulling out, and this woman who has been accused of harming old Korbmacher says, no, that woman was a witch and she caused my child to sicken and die using a charm. Well, the response by the justice, the presiding justice made the following observation. What? That a poor wretch whose sorrows and infirmities have sunk her eyes into her head, and whose features are streaked with the wrinkles of extreme old age, should therefore become an object of terror and be endowed with the powers of witchcraft? It is an idle and absurd superstition. If, however, some damsels that I have seen, animated with the bloom of youth and equipped with all the grace of beauty, if such women were indicted for the offense, the charge might receive some countenance, for they are indeed calculated to charm and bewitch us. But age and infirmity, though they deserve our compassion, have nothing in them that can alarm or fascinate our nature. So he's turned this into a joke about the fact that young women can charm and bewitch men, but old ladies don't do that. That's a superstition. So I think that this is also, again, really interesting language. The language of witchcraft has turned into a language of the charm and bewitching nature of young women, instead of being embraced, right? The story of my child died would have been embraced by the elite 100 years earlier, but now no longer, right? Now, no more. So now we can turn our attention to, so having thought about the horrible fate of Korbmacher, who was indeed abused by a mob and died. Now we can turn our attention to the way we shift into this idea of the charming and bewitching nature of witchcraft. And so we're going to talk about the Romantic witch. So the Romantic movement in many ways was a response to the perceived failures of the Enlightenment vision of progress, which was particularly magnified after the French Revolution. And so we see this in a lot of different places. We see it in evangelical Christian movements that are revivalist faith movements, like the Great Awakenings. And we also see it in a romantic revival of interest in the distant past and in paganism. And witchcraft comes to play a really important role in that revival. In fact, magic and beliefs about the supernatural in general come to play important roles in those movements. So we'll start with, these are the pretty images now. We'll start with this image from Goya, which is titled here on the desk, I guess, that he is sleeping on. So we have this clearly enlightened individual who's been writing and is dressed in the clothes of a wealthy 18th century man who has now laid his head down on the desk. And the desk says, "The sleep of reason brings forth monsters." And you can see emerging from this sleeping individual all of these monstrous forms, owls, bats, there's a giant cat behind him. So all of these creatures emerging, these monsters that are emerging when this reasoned individual goes to sleep. And so I think it's really interesting that Goya chooses to represent it this way, right? The idea that, yes, you can be a reasoned individual, reasoned and rational and enlightened individual in the daytime, but when you go to sleep, the monsters come. And for Goya, this was true. He had some real mental disturbances in his life that caused him to paint some fairly graphic and disturbing images. I'm just going to share one with you. This is the Incantation from 1793, and you can see here these are witch figures who are surrounding this figure in white who appears to be kneeling and possibly begging them to leave them alone, and they're reaching out to get them. And then you can see there's a basket full of babies, and there are also they appear to be holding either babies or possibly little dolls that they are poking. But it's a very dark and very disturbing image. We also have this image, which I really love. This is Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. And the nightmare, in this case, literally is a horse. You can see peering around the corner of the curtain there. But we have this female figure all in white, but sort of thrown across this chaise, and then sitting on her chest is this demon who, interestingly, is actually making eye contact with us in a kind of disturbing way. And so we're seeing then some ideas about the occult, about the supernatural emerging in art in this period as a counter to that idea of reason and rationality. And then we see it coming in some other ways. So this is William Blake's Queen of the Witches, which was painted in the 1790s. And this is a very different image, right? This is not that kind of darkness, that kind of fear that you get from Fuseli's Nightmare or Goya's Incantation. This is a sort of powerful looking female figure with a book and some animals surrounding her. It doesn't suggest that same level of fear, but actually it's almost tantalizing, right? It almost makes you interested, makes you want to learn more about this figure. So we're starting also to see this shift towards a more benign or hopeful image of what a witch might be. This is also then happening in some really interesting ways with folklore. So folklore is going maybe a little bit more in the direction of witchcraft as evil, witches as negative figures, but magic in more general terms is being resurrected as something that could be good. And so Jules Michelet, in La Sorcière, which he published in 1862, actually made the argument that witchcraft practices from the witchcraft trials that had happened in the 16th and 17th centuries were evidence of a peasant revolt against authority through a pagan tradition that was resistant to Christianity. Now, scholars have looked at this since Michelet and have suggested that he is mistaken about that, but these ideas that emerged that this was part of a sort of concentrated pagan resistance to Christianity were really important for the folklorists who were working in the 19th century. They wanted to recover the primitive past, in part as a piece of their search for cultural heritage to support a nascent national movement in the 19th century. And so this is happening in France, it's happening in Germany with the Brothers Grimm, it's happening in England, it's really happening all over the place where they're looking for this evidence of the sort of peasant culture that they see as timeless, that can help them understand their national identity. So one example of this then that we're going to look at is in England with the pre-Raphaelite witch. And these are really the pretty pictures. So this is the one that we used for the flyer advertising the event. This is Frederick Sandys's Morgan Le Fay. And Morgan Le Fay, of course, is a figure from the Arthurian legend who is a magical practitioner and who is being sort of embraced as this powerful female figure by the pre-Raphaelites. And you can see here there's all kinds of interesting stuff happening in this image. She is wearing this ornate and elaborate clothing, including is that a leopard skin that she's got, which would be pretty hard to source in England in the 6th century when the Arthurian legend is supposed to be placed, but you know, okay. And she is doing this magic that involves, you know, burning things and, you know, all of this. And she's got a loom behind her. She's got lots of scrolls sort of scattered around the floor by her feet. But she seems powerful, but not threatening in that way that some of the earlier images seemed. Similarly, here we have Rossetti's Lilith. So Lilith is the wife of Adam before Eve in the kind of mythological Christian past, and here she is combing her hair. She's associated with witchcraft because she opens up the box and releases evil into the world. And you can see here that association then with beauty. So we're coming back to that idea of charm and bewitching being about female beauty. And, right, she's looking in a mirror, combing her hair, also female vanity. Here we have a piece by John William Waterhouse called The Magic Circle. This one I find interesting because we're in this kind of nebulous, not English landscape, and she is performing this magical ritual. She's got a knife in the shape of a sickle, and then a stick that she's using to draw her circle. And she has these lovely birds, black birds, sort of surrounding her here. And in the background, there's a tent. And so, again, there's a lot going on, right? But it doesn't feel scary, it doesn't feel threatening, although it's not entirely clear exactly what's happening. And so I'll end then with the kind of culmination of all of this, which is a painting by Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale called Natural Magic. And here I think you really see the extreme end of the charm and bewitchment of the young and beautiful woman, where she is clearly the magical practitioner here, but that magic is entirely built out of her youthful beauty and their love for one another, and she is crowning him, right? And there's this explosion of nature all around her.